Good afternoon and welcome to this exciting budget work session. Once again, we're here to discuss our money and hail the gang's all here. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Savine.
Thank you, President Zentmeyer, members of the board. I want to take just a moment to thank you for your level of engagement and the questions that you've shared with superintendent and staff in preparation for today's work session. I would be remiss if I didn't first also extend my appreciation to Mr. Prue, our Chief Operating Officer. He's been doing a pretty significant lift there, along with his partners, Mr. Sisler and Mr. Shives and our whole budget and finance team, senior leadership. I want to thank all that contributed. Our goal last week was to respond to board members' questions by the end of Friday. So that way, excuse me, board members had an opportunity to reflect and to review the responses to our budget questions. And much like we did in January, we will follow a protocol where questions received from board members and responses prepared by staff, we will highlight those, and that will provide further reflection from board members, opportunities to ask further questions before you engage in your collective conversation regarding your decision, ultimately adopting your budget schedule for our next business meeting. Mr. Prue.
Thank you, Dr. Spahn, and I think I'd like to, add on to your thanks. We couldn't have done the work we did also without the work of additional department heads, school principals, school staff, assisting in compiling information necessary to get the answers you needed for your questions. I don't want to make light, but I will try to move as quickly as I can through these slides. We do have 46 slides today, which I think might be a new Board of Education of Washington County record for a presentation. So we'll try to work through some of that information for you. We've tried to arrange these slides in a way, not necessarily in the manner in which it came in, but trying to think about some revenue generating questions first, moving through expenses, existing expenses, and then into other programming. And we have a few slides we've added to the end, just some additional considerations for the board at this point in the juncture, especially as we're nearing the end of the General Assembly session. So without further ado, I will kick off. Question number one related to revenues received for career ladder and college and career readiness. To understand that flow and where we'll spend $1 million and what do we get for it. So starting specifically with the teacher career ladder revenue, we're expecting $1.23 million more in FY26 over FY25. This is revenue that comes in to cover the cost of the additional payments to teachers who are nationally board certified. And this allocation is split, as you can see, 71.38% of the allocation is on the part of the state and 28.62% on the part of the local. And again, I'll remind you that all of these aid categories are all wealth equalized, and they all have a slightly different formula, and that's why each of the allocations is a little bit different. Working with the same question, but now also onto college and career readiness. Our revenue for FY26 is nearly $1 million more at $954,000, and the cost really here is related to students that have received the college and career ready moniker based on a number of resources that I won't try to get into because I will screw it up. But I know Dr. Willow is behind me if you have questions on how students get there. But these revenues will help us to cover costs of AP and IB fees, as well as costs for dual credit classes, whether it be tuition and or textbooks. And 68.84% of this allocation is state, and the remainder comes from local government. Rental revenue, of course, is the revenue we receive for the rental of our facilities in relation to and really following policy KG and regulation KGR. The regulation does set forth the rates with which we charge for rentals based on the varying types of groups that may rent our facilities. In FY24, that was nearly $29,000. 48 or almost 50% of that was for before and after care programs for children who stay additionally either before or after the school day. Most of that revenue is run through the YMCA of Hagerstown. They're the lion's share of that revenue. Athletic and other youth events related to another 26% of the revenues, and remaining funds were really related to church services and/or other meetings, HOAs, UAW union meetings, any number of groups that asked to rent our facilities. Miscellaneous revenue is really a bit of that, but it consists of salvage fees on items when they're recycled, rebates from certain product procurements we may make, planetarium ticket sales, and some grant adjustments that may affect the general fund. This was a high revenue in FY24 at $867,000, but you may recall the board last year approved a procurement, which was actually a sale of some of our electronic devices that had reached their support limit. That value was $856,000, and so that was put into this account with an indication that the board did not want those funds reallocated to another expense. So we let those funds drop into last year's fund balance. It's important to note that if an item reaches the capitalization threshold, which is $5,000 or more, to be considered an asset and is therefore is amortized out or depreciated, that item, if it was sold, would actually go to sale of assets under other revenues and not in the miscellaneous category, just to provide a delineation of the two different types of sale or salvage of items. Cost recovery is really any funds received by the Board of Education that cover costs that the Board of Education has already previously paid for and is being reimbursed. So if a request under the Freedom of Information Act is excessive and requires repayment of either staff fees and/or copies, it would fall into this category, as well as if we're making copies under a specific legal case under subpoena, we would charge for the service of creating those copies. We received some reimbursement for transportation costs for homeless students that may be in state-ordered foster care. We receive insurance claim reimbursements that fall in this category, and also for recovering tuition reimbursement. As board members likely know, if staff receives tuition reimbursement under the negotiated agreement and they don't stay for a period of length of time after receiving that reimbursement, they're obligated to pay that reimbursement back. When that money comes back in, it hits this account as a revenue account. In relation to interest income, this question is related to our proposal to increase the interest income and the net effect of what's expected to be lower interest rates over the coming year. So the budget in the current year is $748,515. The proposed budget for FY26 is $1 million even. And through February of the current year, we've realized nearly $1.6 million, and we expect to attain $2 million in revenues for FY26. Based on that, staff believes that the increase, which is about $250,000 from 25 to 26, is warranted, that even with some decreases in interest rates, we don't think they're going to drop as fast that we would not be able to attain the $1 million. And as the board has worked to increase the fund balance, that also increases our opportunities for additional interest income, which can add to that line item. Board members have requested information related to numbers of staff by each of the bargaining units. Here on the left, you can see the staff positions that are assigned by bargaining unit, both CES separated from school-based, by A&S, teachers, and ESP on the left. On the right, you see that same breakdown of positions that are in our restricted funds. Many of those we talked about this morning with the Finance Committee as we gave a briefing on where we are with our restricted fund balances. And then, of course, at the bottom, you can see the combined total of FTE positions for both the general fund and restricted funds. Just slightly more than 3,500 positions. We received a question related to, and we often have this question, what percentage of our budget is what we call staff and staff related. When we say staff related, because we're talking about, of course, the salary of the staff. We're talking about the benefits that are assigned to each of those particular staff members. But when we say staff related, we talk about some contract services that we have in lieu of hiring an actual staff member. So in this category, we're talking about adding in our nursing program and also our school resource officers as a staff cost. You can see this first chart is for the general fund. The top part of the grid tells you a percentage of the budget. The bottom part actually gives you the dollar values assigned to those specific categories. You can see that for FY26, we're anticipating that will be slightly more than 85% and account for $312 million of our roughly $365 million total budget. As we look at all funds, this includes really the nature of the composite budget. The composite budget includes our restricted funds as well as our food service funds and capital funds. So that number goes down slightly, in part because there is no salaries in the capital fund budget. That's all straight construction costs paid out to the construction firms that do the work, and food service fund ratio of salaries and benefits to revenue is less than the general fund, in part because our food service fund encompasses some of our least paid workers in the district. Listing of positions at CS with their current salary was requested. That information was provided. The data on this slide really is a breakdown of what that grouping looks like by fund category, by administrator, by teacher, and by support personnel. This number has been updated slightly from the file that was provided to the board. We did do some additional research related to certain therapist positions that were part of birth decay that should have been on this list provided to you initially when it was provided. So the FTEs you have here reflect the changes that were provided to the board. I had a question related to the FY25 salary resource pool to really go back and look at, what do we have in the budget? What did we end up with? How much was removed? What did it account for? So the superintendent's recommended FY25 budget included $10.1 million as the salary resource pool that would have provided 5% increase for all staff members. At the conclusion of the budget process, the final amount was slightly under $6.5 million. Which allocated 4% for our educational support personnel, 3% for administrators, and 3% for teachers. But it's important to note again, and I think we shared this in January, we talked about historical salaries, 2% for teachers was paid in late FY24 to ensure that we made the requirement of the blueprint that provided a 10% increase to all staff members by June 30th of 2025. That date was specific that it was June 30th and not July 1. So we did a late year increase to teacher salaries, and then 1% was added to that rate on July 1 for effective 3% for increase for the current year. Substitute coverage, we had a question related to how many half and full day subs were utilized in the most recent year. So this chart here outlays that for you in terms, and we broke it down by normal substitutes, which is sort of your everyday on-call sub. Long-term subs are someone's on a medical leave of absence per se. I'm going to fill that position for the next 8 weeks. Resident subs are in their schools every day, providing automatic support to school staff to fill sub openings. And then internal sub coverage is when a teacher covers a classroom for someone else, or at the elementary level in a 3-run classroom, a second grade teacher's out, we don't have a sub, and that class is split between the other 2 classes. Teachers receive additional wages when they provide those coverages. We summarized those, added them up, sort of divided by a 7.5-hour teacher day to come up with the whole day coverage that you see there, that 1784. So in total, in FY24, we had 29,864 full day absences paid out of the general fund, another nearly 6,400 half-day coverages, and then in restricted funds, you had 2,274 full-day and 491 half-day coverages. We utilized that data to handle this next question, which was the cost to increase sub-wages by $10 per half-day and $20 for full-day, and then subsequently, when was the last time sub-teacher wages were increased? So utilizing the data from the previous slide, it would be approximately $700,000 to increase the rates by $10 and $20 per half and full day. And the last sub-rate increase was in January of 2022 when it was increased by $20 a day. And I believe just prior to that, we had a couple of sub-increases right in a row. I know the staff probably has it if that's important to the board members, but over a period of about 2 or 3 years, we had several increases in our substitute rate.
Can I just point out, and I was going to keep quiet on this, but since you brought it up in here, I think what I had asked or proposed was different than what you're providing. I was looking at just an increase in normal substitutes pay increase, not based on the total, because the normal ones are the ones that are making below minimum wage.
So,
And so when you look at that, hopefully in the future, I had the number right here in front of me, it should only amount to $149,195 if we went with a $5 and a $10 increase, and that would get that group above minimum wage. And I know you're doing it based on 7.5 hours, but while I was subbing, it was rare for me to be in a school for less than 4 hours on a part-time day because you're asked to be there early, and sometimes you're asked to stay late. And so I think the 7.5 might be a little short on time. So anyway, maybe we could, that's why I was asking for that. And I think I specifically said about a total for just normal substitutes. The other ones are already above minimum wage.
and we did reflect as we, and we watched back comments from the last meeting to make sure we're capturing questions. We looked at the entire sub rate because the resident sub and the regular sub rate is linked, that the resident sub rate is planned for $30 more than the normal sub rate. So we would be reducing that increase to do that. If we're increasing only the normal rate, we're decreasing the effective rate more that a resident sub makes for giving up every day to be there. That's why we kept that $30 in place. We could look at it either way, however the board sees fit. And we can have conversation with HR about the expectations of our subs beyond what is the school day. We base, when we run the calculation to determine whether it's more than minimum wage, for our subs, we look at 7 hours flat. The teacher day is 7.5. We look at 7 hours flat for our subs, in part because the student day is 6 3/4 hours. So we recognize that they're there a little bit earlier, that they're a little bit later, but there's also a 30-minute period that is not paid, just like our ESP staff, when you would be having your lunch break. That's why we calculated 7.
Even though sometimes you're asked to do stuff in other rooms when,
And
anyway.
And that's a conversation we can have with our
right,
team
right.
because that is impacting the rate, and you should have a duty-free lunch over that period. The law would require it. And then lastly, just wanted to get the sub rates out there. While it wasn't part of the question, we felt it important to list the sub rates and what they are. Subclassification A includes any individual that would have a certification that would allow them to be a teacher in the state of Maryland, or a state that we would have an agreement with that a license could work back and forth. Our B category subs are anyone who would obtain or has obtained a bachelor's degree, and then our C sub rate is any other of our subs that don't meet the first 2 categories. We had a question related to turnover credit, and for I think for the community to understand turnover credit, we do a couple of things here to get to turnover credit. The first thing we do when we plan the budget for the board is we right size the salaries from the prior year to the current incumbents to make an adjustment. Turnover credit then is an assumption that we take in the budget that over the course of the year, some positions will be vacant for some period of time, and since from the time that we've captured and recalculated the current wages, some folks will resign or retire, and the person that's replacing them is at a lower place in the scale. We traditionally have budgeted $3.1 million for that. That's what you can see on the second line down as you look at the last 3 years at $3.1 million. What we achieved, second line from the bottom over the last 3 years, you can see in 22, that number was $6.1 million. In 23, it was 4.7. And in 24, it was 3.7 million. So the variance from what we budget to what we've actually earned in turnover credit is on a decreasing scale. In part, as the further away we've moved from the pandemic, the greater ability we've had to fill positions and fill them quicker, and we're having less turnover. So we are recognizing that we're getting less turnover because we have less vacancies available. So if this is something that the board would want to consider, I'd be hesitant to increase that amount by too much, because I think we're at risk moving forward of seeing this number continuing to decline in terms of what we've achieved over what's been budgeted.
Can I ask a question on that real quick?
Mhm.
Almost kind of piggybacking on the subs. With that many subs, I got to imagine there's quite a few teachers or yet teachers that are taking days off without pay. Where does that fall into?
It would fall in the turnover credit because it would be what they actually paid would be in the actual salaries amount. So, but we also remember that staff can accrue their sick days. If they're not used in 1 year, they're accrued into subsequent years. And the school system also operates sick banks. So if someone's on an extended leave, they can apply to the sick bank for additional leave as well.
Right.
That will also be impacted as we move forward and we think about the Family Leave Act that the state is implementing that's still on the table, potentially to be delayed another 18 months, which is another paid program, but just subject for another day. We had a question about reducing all non-staff expenses by 2%. So going back again to slide 9, which was the slide where we showed what were the value of staff and staff-related expenses. We can calculate that based on that, there's approximately $50 million in the budget that could be considered non-staff related. Some areas of caution in looking at that $50 million, based on the blueprint and the base that we have allocated increases we must make to technology. Anything in the technology realm really should not or cannot be reduced because we have to answer that to MSD in our monthly file feeds of financial data and also to the AIB. If we're reducing technology, we run risk that AIB will hold our revenues until we rectify that situation because they're expecting to see increases in technology. Line items like utilities and bus fuel probably can't be reduced without impacting school operations. That's a significant portion. Special education has many contract services that are required to meet student needs. As a result, just really looking at big round numbers, we think the number you'd actually be reducing from is probably in the area of $25 million. So a 2% savings could yield approximately $400,000. I guess one other caution that's not on the slide is over the last number of years, we've not done really what I'll call minimal inflationary increases to any of our line items, whether it's school materials, textbooks, even the operational supply line, which is cleaning chemicals, toilet paper, paper towels, those types of things. So I'd be concerned on some of those lines that we'd reduce, that we also would impact school operations in that way. We have some questions on library media expenses. Question, could we see all spending aspects that support libraries over the last 2 years? So what you see here is a breakdown of salaries, materials, and dues and subscriptions for both line items sent or spent at school level as well as areas at CES. We did also provide a breakdown for the board on what that looked like on a school-by-school basis. I want to note on the CES line for you, that also includes salaries for the ed tech coaches, which are not effectively library, but they are on the library media page of the budget, which is why we included those here. They don't actually, if you're looking at libraries, they don't actually work in the library, but they're on the library media page. They report to the supervisor of library media based on how the state requires the budget to be created. That's why we included that line for you to look at. Sorry, correction. They're in the Office of Instruction on the budget page, but they report to the library media supervisor, which is why they're on that slide.
What's
Thank
their
you,
titles
Cameron.
again?
What's that?
What was the title of them?
It's the educational technology coaches. And you'll also remember that one of those positions, which is a retirement at the end of this year, has been slated to not be filled in FY26. We had a question on what was the line for testing consultants on the testing and accountability page. Historically, that line was used for vendors such as PowerSchool and Schoolocity, School City, but those services have not been used in several years. That line item is proposed to be a zero account balance for FY26. And historically, we and when we do the final printed budget book, we provide 5 years of actual as well as the planned year's budget. Because this expense now is going to go beyond 5 years, that line will be dropped from the budget book in FY26. There's a question here on the line item, which is in the school principals and school staff page on communications, on what is the proposed budget and what does it fund. This line, it's page 4, line 41, excuse me, page 4 of 41, line 32, has a proposed allocation of $1,075,000 for FY26. And it breaks down roughly in these categories. The WAN, cost for the WAN is $410,000, the wide area network. Fiber connectivity to schools is $110,000 with redundant circuit for $100,000, and then phone service, which includes school-based cell phones, Verizon service into the school, as well as the voice over IP actual phone service that we use. It totals $455,000. In the area of professional development consultants, this area is for training that really is done throughout the system. Here are some examples for FY25. It's an $80,000 budget line, but in FY25, we provided training to IB staff or IB teaching staff, training on the Amplified Science curriculum, CPR for health teachers, care and prevention, which is a required course for all of our coaches, and mentors for staff that are in the Maryland Accelerates program have all been expenses from that line item. It's mostly a training line. Question on what is the $70,000 increase on the clerical additional employment page. This is on page 3 of the budget, line 19. This is predominantly an overtime wage line. Historically, the budget has been $50,000. But this increase that we're seeing when you look at the FY24 actual coincides with the implementation of the UKG timekeeping system. I think historically, when we think about our old timekeeping system, staff were manually entering their time that they worked, and in most cases, I'm a 7-hour employee, I'm a 7.5-hour employee, that's what they would enter, 7 hours, 7.5 hours. But as we're actually implementing a time clock system now, asking people to record punches, we're recording what they're actually working when they're entering the building, when they're leaving the building, what time they start their work or finish their work, which I would argue has actually brought us more in line with the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. We're actually paying people for the hours that they're working. So this increase is to cover the cost of those wages.
So you're saying that you're finding people are working more than that 7.5 hours?
I think they always have been, and we're finally capturing it.
And doesn't this prove my point about subs, that you're being asked to stay longer than 3.5, 7.5 hours?
I think it's in line, yes. Also a question on the clerical sub-expense, page 3, same line, or same page, line 22. This reflects sub-clerical staff that work in all of our schools when a staff member is out. And I want to be clear that not all schools, not all positions would utilize a sub, but in a situation, let's say, where you've got a school that only has one building secretary, one of our smaller elementary schools, we try to fill those as top priority. If you had an absence, let's say, for an AP secretary at South High, they likely would shuffle the work on that given day, and the team of clerical in that building would figure out a way to cover that work and make things happen. But this line has historically been budgeted for $47,500. The proposed increase of $72,500 also aligns with what has been the actual over the last 3 years. When you look back at the historical numbers on this line item, the line item itself has been underfunded, and so we're trying to bring that in line with the actuals. We would also use clerical staff if we, even in a building that has multiple clerical, but if we had an extended absence, someone again on a medical leave, we would look to try to see if we could provide that support. And all of those requests work through the HR department. We have a limited pool of clerical subs, and Sandy Hammond and team usually work on assigning those on a case-by-case basis to the greatest need. We had a question on what were the professional services on page 29, line 11. This is within the maintenance department. Professional services is a line used to pay for predominantly architectural and engineering services within the maintenance department on both large and small scale projects. So Even in a large CIP project, oftentimes we cover the cost of the engineering services out of the general fund, and then the capital project itself covers the actual work that is being conducted. This line also covers inspections that need to be done on certain equipment, like our boilers and chillers, where we use an outside service to provide those annual inspections. And while this line is proposed to increase this year, I think it's important to note that Mr. Rollins found other reductions within the maintenance line, so that it's not an increase in the overall maintenance budget, but he's just moving funds where he needed them to pay for the expenses that he had. AP and IB testing, question on how many tests will be administered this year, and a breakdown by each. We also provided the cost per exam. So opening with the IB test, you can see for the current exam, we've already paid for 312 exams at a cost of $123 per exam. Within AP, we anticipate paying for, at least students have registered for, 2,186 exams. We pay AP at the end of the year after the exams have been taken. And AP does a sliding scale of $53 to $138 per exam based on the course itself and also the meal eligibility status of the particular student. Building insurance is a significant increase. We recognize that, and it's funny, as this question came in, I had a question with my own insurance agent not a week prior about my own homeowner's insurance. But we expect to pay $900,000 for building insurance in FY26. We're in a self-insured pool with many other Maryland school systems hosted by MABE, but the rate increase really is driven by the replacement cost of buildings based on significant inflation in construction materials, and that's really the driver behind that cost is covering the cost of replacement. Question on staff mileage reimbursement to provide a detailed spreadsheet of all mileage. This had also been requested, I believe, through the policy committee. That report was provided to the board this week with the employee's name, their position, and the amount of their expense in FY24, and also whether that expense was coded to the general fund or to one of our restricted funds. And determining where it's coded is based on where is the employee coded. If the employee if their salary is paid out of the general fund, the likelihood is their expense was paid, their reimbursement was paid out of the general fund. If they're paid out of restricted funds, their travel expense goes to the same fund. How many contingency teachers have we funded in the last 5 years, and how many have we used in each of those years? You can see the chart here over the last fiscal year, 5 fiscal years, 2 in 21 and 3 in FY24. You can see the value of the budgeted amount of those teachers. We did not budget any in 22, 23, and 25, and we used all the contingency teachers in each of those years that they were budgeted. I would also argue, I think if we went back and looked at each of the budget summaries for the subsequent years, we probably added some teachers early part in the year that we came to the board for permission for, because we didn't have contingency teachers and we had some bubbles that we had to accommodate for, and we likely came back in August or September and said, we don't have contingency teachers, but I need one. So having them in the budget is a well-planned venture. A question here related to principal allocation and expenses. Schools are provided specific allocations from the general fund as noted here below. On the page that is school principal and school staff, we allocate funding for postage and also for mileage. Under classroom instructional programs, we provide allocations to schools on instructional materials, school improvement team grants, school enrichment activities, and also interscholastic athletics. The athletics comprises approximately 30% of all of those allocations. School accounts also receive donations from nonprofits and from families, fundraising revenues, any number of things, as well as ticket sales from sporting and other events are realized as revenue on the school's chart of accounts. This request for individual school information was very broad. We looked at the chart of accounts for all of our applicable schools, and it would generate 30,000 lines of data. So staff is happy to refine that data. If there's something, we can look at that more specifically. You can share that request with the superintendent. We're happy to refine and try to sort through that 30,000 line items for you. So a question about the plan for computer purchases for the next budget cycle, that is staff devices as well as student devices. Per the WCPS Strategic Technology Plan, the IT department plans to purchase 6,500 student Chromebooks in the March of 26 for deployment in August of 26. So earlier this year, the board already provided approval for the purchase of devices that will be deployed in this coming summer of 25. So this procurement would be during FY 26, but to be deployed for the beginning of the 26-27 or fiscal year 27. So we're always purchasing a year in advance of the deployment. We discussed this morning in Finance Committee as we looked at future procurements, a proposal that's planned to come forward from technology for 1,500 staff devices that would be over a 2-year period, so approximately 750 devices per year. Career Technology Education also plans to purchase 20 iMac computers and 20 personal computers for specific CTE programs in the current, or excuse me, in the next fiscal year.
Jeff, I have a question on
Yep.
the Chromebooks.
Mhm.
That specifically comes funding, is it grant funded or how does that work?
So we have
There's-
a few $1 million in the classroom instructional program line for student devices, and I think it's called small computer devices is that line item. We also still have some grant funds and restricted funds from the ECF grant, which was remember we talked about it this morning, Emergency Connectivity Fund, that we can also offset small computer device purchases with, and I'm not sure there's a deadline on the use of those funds. That was a rebate we actually received for purchases made a few years ago. So we have time to play that down. So I think the IT plan would be to use the general fund money. The expense is more than what's currently in the general fund. So use the general fund money and offset the difference from the ECF fund, and then continue to work down that way through the cycle until the ECF funds are exhausted.
How much of the general fund money is being used for that?
We'll get you the exact line.
So within instruction, currently this year, the budget was 2.175 million for student and staff devices. And then for next year, it's budgeted for 2.5 within classroom instruction.
And is it just earmarked computer or can it be technology as in other avenues of curriculum purchases for computers?
Thinking about the blueprint
programs?
allocation.
Yeah.
It's an increase in overall technology spend, whether it's computer devices for students and staff, staffing to support your technology network, or developing the infrastructure itself.
Okay, thanks.
We had a request for anticipated purchases greater than $10,000 in the coming fiscal year. Staff went to work on this, and I want to be clear that the Board of Education historically has not done zero-based budgeting. In a zero-based budgeting, every staff would come forward with exactly, I want to do this in the coming year. I know I have these expenses, and use that to justify the amount on every line item. I think with our volume, that would be an exhaustive process. But in a lot of cases, staff know they've created their own cycles at the department level. They have planned things that they're looking at. So we worked through that to create a list. It's not an exhaustive list of things that may come before the board over the next year. But that list included 35 line items, had a value just under $9 million, included 7 vehicles split between transportation, maintenance vehicles, and technology vehicles. We had camera plate replacements and new installations, classroom projectors and networking equipment, and any number of other items. But we did not include software expenses that normally come before the board annually, or items that had been approved previously by the board that might be multi-year contracts that are paid on an annual basis, but approved for a period of years.
Mr. Prue, if you may, could you just expand for the benefit of the board? I know we're familiar with the replacement costs on an annual basis with our buses. I know we just had a joint meeting with the Board of County Commissioners, and I know in our conversations, we've discussed the county's policy in terms of replacement vehicles. Could you share perspective on that just for the benefit of the board?
Yeah, and I think there's another slide coming on vehicles that maybe will help to look at that. But the Board of Education doesn't currently have policy or regulation on sort of benchmarks for replacement of vehicles. We sort of have taken them on a basis of it's sort of a time for this vehicle, oftentimes based on when the transportation fleet staff will tell us, hey, this one probably ought to come off the road, the bottom's rusting out, or brake lines, or what have you. So I had a conversation with county staff. They actually shared with me the county's policy. Typically speaking, for sedans, SUVs, vans, light-duty trucks, and a vehicle is eligible for replacement at the county when it reaches a milestone of 10 years or 120,000 miles. And I think I have some data on the current fleet when we get to that particular slide. And of course, our buses, COMAR requires a 12-year replacement cycle on buses. We can request waiver years to extend buses a little bit longer, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we get to one of our later slides as well.
Do we have 15 buses that have reached that point?
Yes, the 12-year mark.
Okay,
Our cycle is built out and scheduled out for every 12 years.
all right.
And before we get to that, did the state change laws to require us to go to electric vehicles yet, or is that still in talks? How is that affecting us?
It's been in talks, but I believe, I can't recall, if there was a bill, I believe. I can't recall if it's fully passed or where it is in the cycle. But there's been some discussion, at least related to sort of the MBA fleet, about pushing out the requirement for electric buses because truthfully, and with what we've seen, it's just not attainable. The benchmark year at this point is not attainable based on the availability and the technology.
So we're not expecting to be required to switch over at a certain point in time right now.
That's my understanding, is the state's going to push the year out, potentially as far as a decade. On cue, the next slide, we provided a listing of all of the board's vehicles: sedans, SUVs, passenger vehicles, trucks, dump trucks, vans, you name it. The average life of the fleet is 10.44 years. The average odometer reading is fairly low at 57,000. We're averaging 5,802 miles per year based on that data. But thinking about the what we just talked about in terms of the county's approved replacement cycle, 34% of the fleet is already at 15 years old. 12% of the fleet has also attained 120,000 miles. We're not proposing anything at this point. It's just information. And that's something I think if staff is interested in something, we'll vet that through legal counsel and the policy committee. We had a question on total budget, salaries, and job duties for our PPWs and how we measure their success. On the salary line, we have the general fund provides for 8 PPWs at a cost of $1,083,304 for wages and benefits. The restricted fund provides 1 additional PPW at a cost of $158,390. This average cost is higher than the average cost on the ones in the general fund, in part because when we're billing salaries to restricted funds, we also include the cost of pension. So that elevates the cost that you see here. If we took that out, the numbers would be more in line across our PPWs. COMAR requires a pupil personnel program that focuses on health, personal, interpersonal, academic, and career developments of students, and recommends a ratio of 2,500 students to one pupil personnel worker. We're right about that with the 9 PPWs that we have in the county. And detailed information on the job description and measuring their success was provided to board members in the response on Friday.
How much of those COMAR regulations overlap with what community school managers are doing?
Calling it a lifeline? I think a fair amount.
Okay, so they have very distinct sets of responsibilities. They're all related to providing wraparound services for students, but our COP managers have very specific tasks to complete that meet the needs of the grant. So they have to do a lot with creating community partnerships, assessing the needs of the school, building out those programs that benefit all students within the school environment related to the use of those funds. The PPWs take a much more holistic look with all things academic for students, attendance intervention, mental health resources. They work in a similar way, but they have very distinct sets of work, if that makes sense.
No, but I think I understand still.
I didn't hear you, Daryl.
It doesn't make sense, but I think I do understand.
It's all very and I understand the confusion in the sense of it's all about the whole child and all of the things outside of the school, but the community school managers have very specific work related to the grant funds, and the PPWs work for the school system. Well, they all work for the school system, but they're charged with tasks that have to do with academic and social emotional well-being, not necessarily related to the grant funds and the execution of this COP projects.
But so I guess the community school managers still do that stuff where they make sure there is attendance, they make sure that health is there, they don't get into that?
Their job is not to, the way that the COP grant is set up is their job is not to be embedded in the day-to-day intervention with students. Their goal is to create a program that supports a community school. So they're not to get tied up in individual student intervention. They're much more programmatic. Thank you for the probing question. That helped me with the answer. They're much more programmatic than a PPW that is very targeted. They would be involved in SST, the student support team meetings. They would be doing home visits, all those kinds of things. Not to say that a community school manager wouldn't necessarily support it, to your point, but their job is really holistic community school programming, not individual student intervention.
Thank you.
Dr. Webster. Similarly, a similar question on our safety security assistants about the goals and objectives for our school safety assistants and how we measure their success. You can see the primary goals here for our security assistants, assisting school administrators in ensuring a safe environment for students and staff, assisting school administrators with student investigations, building relationships with students that also lead to additional supports related to school safety. We provided more detail on that in our response to you. We also provided specific trend data on referrals and suspensions that showed from the start of school through a date in February or a date in March where we sort of cut off the data for this year, but we also used that same cutoff date in the prior fiscal year so that you were seeing apples to apples. So that you can see in most of those cases, the data in terms of student suspensions and referrals is declining since we've had the implementation of the security assistant program. Now we're coming on some other programs. We had a cost about our total liability for Children's Village over the last 3 years, broken down salary, maintenance, and general expenses. You can see the costs here, the total cost for Children's Village over the last 3 years from $107,000 up to $170,000 in FY24. You can see the salaries, the contracted services, supplies, materials, other charges also includes specific benefits.
Jeff, I have a question for that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
Go ahead.
Charlie, go ahead.
Good.
It just, I was thinking that I went by there the one day and it was all gone. Are they rebuilding that?
The Children's Village itself is still there on a much smaller piece of property. The Board of Ed last year agreed to sell, off the top of my head, I want to say approximately 27 acres between
not true
Children's
that they're
Village
building a new
and
one.
Ruth M. Monroe Primary for the new housing facility for the Meredith School of Osteopathic Medicine. So that's that's what's being built on that grounds currently, but Children's Village still exists on the postage stamp that it needed.
Right, so they're not building a new one?
No,
Okay.
nope, it's staying as is.
Go ahead, Mike.
So years ago, when they came to us, the school system, and then asked us to help them, for some reason, I have $125,000 was earmarked per year for that.
By the general fund or by the Board of Ed?
I don't remember but I know there was a certain amount, and I'm pretty sure it was $125,000 we were supposed to be responsible for.
So the way the agreement is written, and we update that agreement annually, is that we have the cost for the clerical staff that organizes and schedules all of the student groups in and out and coordinates the scheduling of the instructors. We also have the ongoing everyday maintenance of the facility, the cleanliness of the facility, any materials that are needed. And the Children's Village Board provides funding and support to make some capital investments. So for instance, right now, I believe we're working with them on an HVAC replacement for the rear building, where we're replacing a rooftop unit and some other controls. Sort of an in-kind donation where they've raised the funds and have bid that project. We're working on that with the Children's Village Board. So they're still making capital investments into the program, but we have the operating costs. So the amount will fluctuate from year to year based on those annual costs.
And do we have an agreement somewhere that says that we would increase a certain amount each year, or is it just whatever the cost is? That
I think it's whatever the cost is because the staff is ours. We absorbed the staff. The clerical staff member there now is a WCPS employee, no longer a Children's Village employee. The custodian staff is our staff.
How often does that get utilized throughout the year?
Nearly every day. I mean, every second grade class goes. And additionally, there are private schools and other schools that send their students to Children's Village. So during the school year, it's regular. It's used regularly.
so you're saying every day?
I can't answer that specifically, but I mean, if you figure how many, if we've got 26 elementary schools with second grade classes, they can't even at our largest buildings, they can't go every day. It's a 2-day program. So I could get that data for you in terms of the number of operating days.
And do we charge for that service?
I believe there's a charge to non-WCPS groups that go, and I can get that answer as well.
Because that's not listed on any of this here revenue for that.
Right. We'll get that answer.
Thanks.
Can I ask a question about the supplies and materials? It seems kind of like a reoccurring theme where the supplies and materials have gone up dramatically for every category that we've seen.
So it looks like expenses are increasing year over year. A lot of that is the way the expenses are being tracked. Prior to Blueprint, expenses weren't always tracked at the school level. It was mostly salaries and benefits. So from 23 on, we've gotten better at tracking the expenses back to the school level. Most significantly in 24, we really got everything at the school level because that's when it was required by Blueprint to have all of the expenses tracked. So when you see supplies, materials, contracted services, and stuff like that increasing in 24, that's because we are tracking more accurately to the school level for all the expenses instead of it being thrown into a generic location account like 000 or here at central office. So the increase that you see is more from an accounting standpoint rather than a true increase that's happened over the years.
So the increase of $10,000 for contracted services at Children's Village, but yet it was only $1,000 the previous year.
Yeah, so as I think about Children's Village in FY24, depending on snow removal on any given year, that can adjust the cost. I also think in FY24, on the land we sold was the sand mound for Children's Village. So we worked through a process to connect to the public sewer running along Mount Etna Road. So we have, in that contracted services would be a tap fee to connect to the city's sewer system. So that's why you would see an increase into FY24. Similar question also related to the outdoor school at Fairview. Here, 22 through 24, you can see salaries, contract services, supplies, materials, of course, other charges again, which were the benefits costs. And similarly to Children's Village, outdoor school expenses are all funded from the general fund.
Yeah, there again, I mean, that big jump in contracted services.
Right, so what I'm hearing from Karen is that's an area where nursing services would not have historically been charged there. They would have been charged just in a generic account. So as we're costing things out and pushing things out to the schools, that's your fee for nursing services at Fairview on days when students are there. Yep. And similarly, third slide looking the same about the planetarium. You have the cost here for the planetarium, and that is also a program funded by the general fund.
I actually had a question about that. I know in the miscellaneous revenue, you had that part of that 867,000. Do we know the actual amount of what the revenue is generated from ticket sales?
We can pull that.
It's usually pretty small, just a couple to a few $1,000s, because that's only for the evening, nighttime programs that don't
Right,
occur every
everything else.
day. Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'll continue. We'll come back to that answer when we have it. We've talked regularly about our apprenticeship program that provides for reading apprentices that we've operated the last, I want to say 2 years, 3, maybe it's 3 now. I believe it's the 3rd year this year. As you may recall, this was initially created and funded out of the Maryland Leeds grant. That grant dissolved before the FY25 year. We were lucky enough to receive additional grant funding from MSDE to operate that program for a 3rd year this year. It is not currently in the general fund budget to continue. There does not appear to be grant funds available at this juncture that we are aware of. We're still hopeful that that may be an opportunity. But in terms of the cost, you can see how each apprentice is budgeted. For each apprentice you have, you've got a budget cost of about $9,600. It's 15 hours per week for at $15 an hour for 35 weeks. And then each apprentice is matched one-on-one with a supervising teacher, and that teacher also receives a $1,000 stipend. Based on that data, 70 reading apprentices would cost $672,000, and 15 math apprentices would cost approximately $144,000, $2,800.
How many do we currently have for reading apprentices? Is it 70?
No, I believe it's 35.
Okay.
35. And to the previous question on the planetarium, the revenue in FY24 was $2,800.
I believe that, if I'm stand corrected, that didn't we have 70-some apply this past year, and we could only do 30?
We had around 60 that applied, yes.
Okay, so we had a lot more apply, and we couldn't accept them because we just didn't have the funding. And do we still have the 32 or whatever that we started out, or did we lose a few this year?
I'll yield to Dr. Willow. I believe we are right around the 35 mark.
Yes, there's always a little bit of transition, especially from first semester to second semester when a student's schedule changes and they can't continue, or they may have earned all of their hours and are seeking other transition as they graduate, but our number is pretty consistent right around 35. If we lose one, we'll post and rehire.
One up. Okay, good. Thanks.
I'm sorry, before we go on, so that 35 that we have is not because that's all that were qualified, that 35 is because that's what was budgeted for?
That's the amount that
Little
is
bit of
grant
both.
funded right now.
Okay.
So it's been, since inception, which is 3 years, the grant funding has been right around $330,000. But to Mr. Gesford's point, the interest in terms of students wanting to go into the Reading Apprenticeship program is nearly double what is funded.
And we also have to take into account what the need is at each school, meaning that, we reach out, how many tutors can school X take? What are the times in the day? So it's not always just supply and demand that make that number. Sometimes it's also just looking into account a student's number, or a student's schedule, and also the school schedule on when literacy and the need is. And so 35 has tended to be our number because that also tends to be where we need the support at schools. We've never explored going higher just because that's where we've been at within the budget.
Dr. Willow, just for the benefit of the board too, we've targeted for 3 years the Reading Apprenticeship Program. I know we've had some discussion regarding math apprentices. Certainly, we value and recognize the benefits of additional support in terms of math apprentices, but also understand, based on our previous conversations, that it's a little more complex in terms of delivering those services when we compare it to our reading apprentices. Can you explain a little bit more so that board members understand the complexity of those two initiatives?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great question. So when we're talking about how we use a literacy tutor, we're working on certain skill sets that a student has a gap in that potentially could be kindergarten, first, second grade. If you think back to some of our science reading presentations, math can be a little more difficult only because the content changes as we go up from kindergarten to first grade to second grade. And so therefore, you have to spend more time on the training, whether, when you're looking at someone that needs help in fluency or decoding or vocabulary, it's very different than, all right, this is a kindergarten student that needs help in kindergarten math content versus second grade content versus fourth grade content, just because of the complexity of the math content as students get older. Not impossible, just different in terms of how we use literacy versus math.
I have a question before you leave. Do we have any way to collect data to evaluate the efficacy of those apprentices as far as the students' achievement?
Yes, and that's a good reminder to our listening public, but also new board members. Every year, typically May, I think, or June, we do a formal report to this board on the number of tutors, the number of hours, student growth data, and so we would probably look to do that again here later this year when we get final numbers back in from our spring assessments.
And can I piggyback on that real quick? Because to Dr. Zentmeyer's point, I really kind of want to focus on, goal-oriented spending this year. I asked the question about the school safety assistants, and, the goals that were listed are nothing more than part of a job description. They're not actual goals. And to go and say something like, referrals are down, well, I could go and say that this apple's red and the other's green, so the red one's more healthy, but how does that actually correlate? Where's the data that suggests that this is specifically the cause that we were looking for? So, to Dr. Zentmeyer's point, I would like to see that for this as well. And then when you go and mention there's 26 schools and we want to have 70 reading apprentices, I got to imagine it'd be pretty difficult to have 3 kids in a classroom from a teacher standpoint going and teaching other kids too. So that does make sense, but I would be curious about the math also. If we saw that we had the success with the reading apprentices and we had the capacity, I'd love to have 3,000 of them, to support each kid. So I don't know exactly how we could go and support that, but I would like to focus on this and make this be a priority, but make it be very specific for what our goals and what our outcomes are with this, because I think we have seen proven success with those reading apprentices. I think, if we can truly prove that and see that, then what can we do to make that work for math? Because our math scores are not very good at all either, so.
Okay. Moving on to summer school programming, the cost to add summer school for the most needy students at elementary and middle school. So we looked at an elementary program that would operate similar to the high school program in that it would be 4 weeks for 4 days in the month of July, 16 operating days, 4 hours a day for elementary and middle school, as opposed to high school has the opportunity for students to go more full day in terms of whatever they need for either credit recovery or credit advancement. At elementary level, we would conduct the elementary program at each elementary school. We believe that's where it would have the most success and the most interest, as opposed to a regionalized program. Cost for that would be approximately $425,000 for the instructional programming, about another $250,000 for the transportation costs. On the middle school program, again, same focus, 4 weeks in July, 4 hours a day, 4 days per week. Cameron's advising me that I may have had a typo here. It's not 320,000 for the instructional program. It's more along the lines of 170. So please make note of that on your slides. Transportation cost estimated at 100, and this would be a regionalized program. As we looked at this one, we probably would run it near where we're running the high school program, but likely in a different building, so we could utilize the same transportation. As we thought about and looked at how many buses we had, how many buses we operated based on what the capacity would be, we felt as if the cost last year was $113,000 for the high school program. This would have to include a midday run plus some buses. We would probably have to add a few buses because some buses were near capacity already. So just a big round ballpark number for the board to consider at this point, but wanted to get that in front of you. If we want to delve in more, we also would want to look at what the cost would be for if we have specific needs where we need to provide nursing in all those buildings while we have a summer school programming operating. Sometimes that's based on the needs of the particular students enrolled, so those costs are not calculated here that we would have to account for.
I gotta imagine, like, we wouldn't have one at Bester and at Dow. Couldn't we just combine those and kind of cut in half? Because I can't imagine every single student would do that also.
Maybe, but my hunch, our youngest learners and their families would be more comfortable sending their child to their home elementary school as opposed to sending them even to a neighboring one, even when they're not really that far away from each other. That's my hunch, but I'd have to say I would want to hear from our parents, perhaps. Talking about virtual instruction and specifically the cost to add back the elementary ABLE program. If we go back to offering grades 1 to 5, we would need 1 additional teacher for each of those grades, as well as 2 encore teachers. Estimated cost here, $609,455. Based on that expected new teacher cost, and that's the cost we would budget all new teachers in this year's budget, based on salary and benefit costs of $70,065. Excuse me, $87,065.
But if we look at the money that we get per student, wouldn't this still be less expensive than brick and mortar?
Your question, though, really is it's a two-part question. If you're taking all your current existing students that are in grades 1 to 5, and you're taking some that now are going to the virtual programming, to leave them where they are has no cost. To add a virtual program adds $600,000. If you can increase enrollment because you have a virtual program, the question is how much of that cost is offset by the state and local funding you'll receive in the next year by having that program.
Gotcha.
Question on special education programming as well. How much does it cost to staff a special education classroom, such as RISE, Connected, et cetera? Specifically, your Summit, RISE, and Connections programs are staffed similarly with a teacher and 2 paraprofessionals. So based on the cost we gave you previously for a new teacher and the costs that's budgeted for paras, you'd have $188,000 in those 3 programs. The STEP program is a little bit more, $238,000, because you have an additional paraprofessional in a STEP classroom.
And how
That's per
many,
school.
sorry,
No, go ahead.
Go
how
ahead,
many
Ashley.
students are typically in these classes?
I have that. Give me a minute.
It's
I
fine,
can get that for you.
sorry.
That's what I was thinking that. On average, 8 to 10 per classroom. So in closing,
I'm sorry, how many of these programs are across the county? Does each school have one of these programs?
No. Please hold. How about I let Dr. Webster get that data and we'll keep moving. So looking ahead at some additional budgetary considerations, just things that have come up since the superintendent has provided the recommended budget to you. And since that time, the board has approved the contract for the coming year on a new contractor for school health services. While they're the lowest bidder, based on the specifications of that bid, we do believe that the cost for nursing services will be higher than what's currently in the proposed budget or your draft budget by about $400,000. So we should look at opportunities to increase that individual line item. We also have received the most recent invoicing on the pension system. This is specifically related to the employee side and not the teacher side. And we expect our pension payments to increase by $150,000 in FY26. We've met with all of our principals and some of our community school coordinators related to their concentration of poverty grants, looking at their plans for FY26 and how those plans match up to their needs assessments. One location in particular had a request to reduce a pre-K para that is planned for next school year and to actually replace that with a half-time social worker that they can match up with additional funding from their concentration of poverty grant to create a full-time social worker in their position. This position would work predominantly with their pre-K families as well as the other families in their elementary school. And so we would look to seek consensus from the board if that's a change staff could make. It has zero cost implications to the budget.
I have a question.
Yes.
So each pre-K room has a teacher and a para. So how will you replace one para with a part-time social worker?
I will refer to Dr. Willow, who I think has those details.
So it's probably it's not a true replacement. The para that's in there is still the para that will remain in the pre-K classroom. If you go back to your original budget presentation, I believe, Mr. Prue, there were 7 paraprofessionals added to pre-K. Pre-K is different than K through 12. Pre-K has its own funding source per student, and just like K through 12, where 75% follows the student, pre-K specifically, 75% follows the student. Initially, Williamsport was slated to get an additional paraprofessional that would support the different classrooms. Instead of that additional para, they now are asking for a social worker to meet the needs of their students. And so we're not removing any existing staff from Williamsport. If we were to go back and recreate that slide, it would now say 6 paraprofessionals and 0.5 social worker to the general budget, which is why it's budget neutral.
Okay, thank you. That
You're
makes
welcome.
sense.
That poverty grant, is that a permanent grant or is that you have to apply every year and hope you get it?
It's written into the blueprint bill. It's based on the free and reduced meal eligibility level of each building, with students at or schools with 55% or more free and reduced rate are eligible for that grant. It comes in 2 parts. It comes in a personnel grant, which provides for the community school manager and a registered nurse in each building. And then in year 2, you begin to receive a per pupil allocation that can be used for additional staffing and or additional programming in your school based on the school's individual needs assessment.
Is that where we're at now, year 2? Is that
They're in Williamsport Elementary is in at least in year 2, if not year 3.
But that's a one lump sum for all of our schools, correct?
No, each individual school receives their own allocation. Each individual school in concentration of poverty has their own allocation, and that allocation has to be 100% spent at their school.
Right, but what I was asking was if they say like you get $5 million for all of your schools, then it's broken down between the schools that actually qualify?
The allocation is given to us by the state on a per school basis.
Okay.
because each school is at a different point. Some schools are in the first year, so they only have the personnel grant. Some schools are now in year 4 or year 5, so their per pupil allocation increases based on the number of years you're in the program. So a school like Bester and Salem that were in the program from the very beginning, from the first year, are now on like year 5. So they're receiving the highest per pupil allocation in the district. So each school's allocation is specifically different.
Okay, thank you.
Another item we wanted to present to the board, and this is a new item. I think you've heard bits and pieces of this over the years, but this is related to transportation services for our schools at Ruth M. Monroe Primary and Eastern Elementary School. They're on as a matter of background, we operate 4 tiers of busing services. Tier 1 are our earliest schools through our Tier 4, which is our latest schools. Ruth M. Monroe Primary has a start time of 9 a.m. and a completion time of 3:45. Since the time it was opened, Eastern and Ruth M. Monroe were put on Tier 4, in part because there was not funding available for drivers and additional buses to figure out how to get those 2 schools embedded into the 3-tier system that was already existing. But at the same time, we didn't want the school to be any later than it absolutely had to be. So it was placed with that 9 a.m. start time, 3:45 dismissal time. The challenge is all of our buses across the system are tied up on Tier 3. Tier 3 is every high school system-wide, the middle schools in the county, with the exception of Springfield, and Salem Avenue and Bester Elementary are all running on Tier 3, and every bus is in use during that route structure. They dismiss at 3:30. So I think it would be, just thinking about it, if you're in a school parking lot, let's say at South Hagerstown High School at 3:30, the drive over to Ruth M. Monroe Eastern is at least 10 minutes, and you've not taken the time to load a bus full of students and to then drop them off to try to get to Ruth M. Monroe Eastern campus by 3:45. As a general rule, most of our buses are not getting onto that campus till 4 o'clock or later. As a result, our teaching staff are losing some of their end of the day planning time because they're still monitoring and taking care of students. And historically, and I think research would show that for our youngest learners, early in the day is best. And so we struggle on that campus with students that really beyond 2 o'clock, the day is just an ultimate struggle. We've spent a lot of time looking at this during the 21-22 school year. Myself and Brian Johnson and several staff members had several meetings working after school, trying to work out a way to get buses onto that campus sooner. And unfortunately, any little blip that happens over the course of a day, a parent of a pre-K student is not available on a Tier 1 or Tier 2 school to pick up their child. So now that bus is sitting on a curb waiting for that parent to show up, or has to double back to the school to drop off that student back at the school so they can continue with the rest of the routing for the rest of the day. All of those blips that happen on the screen all day long in transportation fall on the Tier 4. And so that's why they have the most buses that are delayed. We spent some time with transportation. We asked Brian Johnson and his team to put together a plan. And what we would like to propose is that we phase in a change for this campus to move them off Tier 4 and essentially become a Tier 1 school. It's like what I like to call a Tier 1A and a 1B. Our existing ones would be 1B. This school would be a 1A with a proposed start time of approximately 7:20 in the morning. Which is about 10 minutes earlier than what some of our other elementary start times are that are on Tier 1. And some of our middle schools that are on Tier 1 actually start at 7:20 currently. We might juggle the rest of the schedule a little bit, but we uniquely have chosen a focus of moving towards fiscal year 28 or August 27, because that's also the year of the new school to open out front. And we're going to have adjustments in the tier schedule anyway. So while we're making those adjustments, it makes sense for us at least to make that adjustment. we'd like to phase into the step. If you followed what's happened with transportation in other Maryland LEAs over the last couple of years, specifically, watching what happened in Howard County or Anne Arundel County over the last couple of years, where they adjusted their entire school scheduling, and ultimately they had failures at the start of the year because they didn't step through a plan and they made just a move all at one piece. And I'd like to thank the transportation staff for being very methodical and thoughtful about how we could get to adjusting. This is a fairly major move to our tier schedule. So what we'd like to do, if we can find available funds, is add 5 drivers in FY26 at a cost of approximately $250,000. Those 5 drivers, their first assignment would be assigned to Tier 4. So at the end of the day, at 3:45, there are 5 buses ready to dismiss students at that campus to take some of the load off those buildings. Those 2 schools combined have 19 buses. We would then ask for 8 additional drivers in FY27. The new plan that Transportation's put forward requires 13 additional buses, 13 additional drivers. So we would ask to increase another 8 drivers in FY27. And along the way, we would be monitoring and saying, can we make the FY28 start date for this implementation? Have we met the benchmark? Were we able to find 5 more drivers in 26? Were we able to find 8 more drivers in FY27? Are we on schedule to make this tier move before we would actually cut it loose and make the move? We'd like to entertain increasing the starting wage for our drivers. We're hanging in there right now, sort of in a 1-to-1. You lose a driver, we get a driver. But to increase the number by 13, we think we'll need an increase in the starting wage for our bus drivers. Additionally, we'll have to seek waiver from MSDE on the 12-year bus rule for a number of periods where we'll also have to increase, let's say, our bus replacement cycle by 1 over a number of years until we can increase to have 13 more buses. And again, this transition would coincide with the opening of the Downsville Pike Elementary, so that we wouldn't have 2 transitions, we'd have 1 with our overall tier schedule. I want to stop before I go to the last slide just to see if board members have any specific questions. I know I ran through that fairly quickly.
I'm wondering where you're going to get the additional funds at.
Well, me too.
I mean, honestly, everybody's talking about there's not enough teachers in the classrooms and higher wages and yeah.
Well, and so as we've been
Blueprint, maybe.
as
pony
we've
up
been
for it.
thoughtful about this, and maybe if there's not any other questions, I'll segue to the next slide.
I was just gonna say, I'm kind of confused. So we're saying that we're gonna close 2 schools to open 1, so we're gonna reduce the amount of runs we would need there, right? And then
Potentially, yes.
we're gonna also add 5 drivers over the course of the next 2 years. And then by the end of those 2 years, move those buses back to tier 1 so that we don't need to have the extra runs. I'm struggling to see, at that point, didn't we just reduce the need for those extra 5? And I don't know, in my head, it sounds like those changes that you're talking about would reduce the need for those drivers.
You currently have 19 buses servicing those 2 schools. We're requesting 13 because we think that's what we need to make the move. That may be less, but we won't know that until we go through the redistricting process for the Downsville Pike. Both the schools, both Hickory and Fountain Rock, are fully transported. There's no walking zones for those schools. There's not likely to be a walking zone for Downsville Elementary. However, based on the redistricting, you may have some students that could potentially walk to a different school that they're redistricted to. There is some possibilities for that staff has started to look at as they planned for their presentations to the Facility Enrollment Advisory Committee. So there is a likelihood that you may be able to reduce from that 13.
Like I said, I was just kind of confused on that, and I can't imagine we're making this decision now, so just something to clarify in the
Not,
future.
yeah, not asking for a decision today by any means.
No, but to your point, I mean, you're not increasing the number of students, you're actually decreasing the number of schools.
Correct. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're decreasing the number of buses needed.
Jeff, what about contracted?
Linda, go ahead.
No, I just want to say, Jeff, I've been at Ramps and Eastern when they've dismissed, and I've seen how long it takes. And I feel for the teachers, the staff that have to stay so long. And also at Salem, the same thing happens. We had a bus that had to do, might have had more than one, 2 runs. And so when you wait for that other bus to come back, luckily we had enough paras to cover, and the teachers could go back to their rooms, but they still didn't get their full planning time
Correct.
at the end of the day.
Correct.
So it is a problem.
The additional drivers not only help this situation, but with this flip, putting these drivers at the front when we get to the transition in 28, you also have those drivers that are then available through the rest of the tier schedule. So you have an opportunity to eliminate a lot of double backs that we have throughout the system where one bus for a particular school, what we say when a double back is, one bus for a particular school takes 2 groups of students. I'm going to load up a bus full of students. I'm going to go to the shortest distance where I can get the most students off quickly, turn around, come back to the school, pick up the next group of students, and take them to wherever they need to go. So we have an opportunity to eliminate some of those double backs as well throughout the system on tiers 2 and tier 3 with these additional drivers to provide additional services to all of our schools as well as to get our students home sooner.
Mike?
What about contract buses? Have we thought about that? Is there an opportunity?
It's a possibility, but I don't think it saves cost. Typically speaking, every time we have a route open, we run a budget tool, for lack of a better term, to say, what would this cost us if we run it ourselves? What would it cost us if we contract it? If it's cheaper to run it ourselves, we try to run it ourselves.
Okay.
And because these schools are so close to the center of the county and close to the bus depot, the likelihood is cheaper to run it ourselves. Because you don't have what I call deadhead miles that a bus runs with nobody on it. So the more miles you have with deadhead miles, the likelihood is it's better to have a contractor from that region operating that route.
Okay, it's not like we haven't received a lot of information today.
I got one more slide.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I added one today, sorry. Back to Mr. Burkett's question about funding. You know, as we have thought about this and planned for things, we thought a lot about the first bill that's up there, Senate Bill 429, House Bill 504, the Excellence in Maryland Public Schools Act. This, of course, as we've just been talking about, is the governor's bill. There's been a lot of discussion on this bill, and we were hopeful early in the session that potentially additional foundation funding would be coming to the Board of Ed. For a time period, it looked like maybe that was going to happen. Of late, the latest update is that both the Senate and the House have pretty much approved their versions of the bill. I'm not sure if the Senate is entirely done. The two, of course, don't align, so they will have to go to conference committee. But we don't believe it's likely that we'll receive that additional foundation funding in FY26. So I think based on the budget, the way you have it today, those are your revenues. I think that's what you should plan, is that's your revenues that you have to work with from a planning perspective. The other news, the second section of this slide is other news that we received. Dr. Savine received a letter on Saturday from Dr. Wright, the state superintendent. Provided with that memo was a copy of a memo from U.S. Department of Ed's Secretary McMahon that all late liquidation for any of the COVID relief grants ceased on Friday afternoon last week. We, as well as other those at MSD and other LEAs across the country and other states, had received approval from Department of Ed for what's known as a late liquidation or a tidings amendment to be able to spend those COVID relief funds through September 30th of 2025. We have about $3.34 million remaining in funds that have been encumbered to spend under those grants, the largest of which is $3 million for engineering, contract management, and actual construction to complete the Williamsport High School HVAC replacement project that is underway and has its last and final phase this summer of replacement equipment. There's some remaining closeout funding of about $285,000 on the Marshall Street project, and then just a handful of other dollars here and there that could be absorbed by the general fund if we needed to, but that $3 million for the Williamsport HVAC is a challenge. I, by any means, not sure that this decision that came on Friday is final. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion on this, but we wanted to have this in front of you. Additionally, we also, I don't want to forget, we also have $125,000 in American Rescue Program homeless grant funds that are available as well. One of those is the biggest amount is a program that the board has approved where we're working in conjunction with Horizon Goodwill with some homeless navigators, helping some of our homeless families find housing. So just wanted to make the board aware of those. I'm not alarmed yet, but it is something we're keeping well on our radar screen.
So the money you say is not coming now from the state, is that what we discussed? Is that the same funds, the additional funds from the state?
Right, these would be, so
they were money that the governor was
proposed-
cutting out,
Yep.
and then you
we
thought
thought maybe
might
they
be
would
coming
come
in.
early on. We thought they'd come, and now we're not very
So that
positive
means,
on that.
okay.
Yeah, I think, I don't think there's any way. I think those funds are going to be gobbled up to address part of the state's fiscal cliff. With that, I think I'll hand back to Dr. Svine, Dr. Zentmeyer.
I'm going to go around and let anyone give any closing remarks first, starting with the person who represents the most impacted group. Daphne, do you have anything to add?
I was actually wondering if, going back to the apprenticeship thing, if it becomes too much of a burden on our budget, would it be possible to still pursue the initiative, but as a strictly voluntary program, to provide SSL hours to students or to provide them like a sort of professional experience? Because I know many students who would still volunteer for a program like math tutoring or English tutoring, even without the pay. So I think it's still something that we should pursue and not something that we should look over just because we don't have the funds to do it.
Charlie?
Going to what you're saying, maybe even just providing a set smaller stipend
Yeah.
to that group.
Linda?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. One, if you've never been to outdoor school or children's village, you need to go and see it. They're wonderful programs. They benefit our children greatly. The other thing I want to say is I want to thank the staff and Dr. Savine for answering this many questions in 4 days. I know we have a few new board members, and you asked a few questions, and they were very good questions. But I would hope that the next budget session that we have next year, that we start asking these questions a little earlier so that they don't have to take time away from serving the students of Washington County to get all this information together in 4 days. Because we've had many budget cycles, many budget meetings. So that's my hope for next year.
Ashley?
I'm good.
Yeah, I appreciate all the hard work done by staff. I know we did ask a lot of questions. For me personally, I think we have a very good start with this budget, and there's a lot of good things that I see in it. You know, to kind of go back to the goal-oriented spending here, there is still a lot of spending that is just increases from what we've currently been doing. And I personally would like to see us be more goal and outcome oriented. I know it's a lot easier said than done to just say cut 1% across the board and save $3.5 million and then make a couple other cuts. But I think we need to go and look at making some of those hard cuts to go and shift that spending to other areas where we could maybe go and add a math tutoring program for either kids that are struggling. But I also feel as though we're kind of leaving behind some of those kids that are excelling also and giving them extra opportunity to even expand upon their success. So I think we need to really look at where we spending this money and how specifically does it help us increase our scores. I know our scores have been going up, but I think it's reasonable to say that they should also be going up quicker. And if we keep on doing the same thing over and over again, we're not going to see the different results. So I think we can go and make some of those more difficult cuts and adjust where we're spending that money to go and really focus on ensuring that we're giving our kids the added supports they need, because I don't see us really changing the supports we're giving them. We're just doing more of the same. So I think that'll be something that I'll be looking for in the coming weeks here as we look to make our vote.
I agree with Daryl from the goal. I think you perfectly worded that, goal-oriented budget. You know, it's hard for someone not in it every day to go and suggest specific cuts. So I think looking for where we can reduce so that we can increase the apprenticeship program, we can add a summer school for elementary would be ideal for me so that we can see those test scores and support our students in where they have academic need.
Well, I would like also to thank the staff for doing this. It's been a long budget process, and I think this is a fluid document that changes very often, and so that there's going to be a lot of questions asked in the beginning and a lot of questions asked in the end, because we come to the point where now it's starting to come down to the final vote. And when you start looking at the documents that come in and you start seeing more questions, I think a lot of the public starts asking board members questions because they don't know from the beginning. So I disagree with Mrs. Maria saying that we should allow, you know, all this stuff to come in the beginning and not ask any questions in the end. I think that's absolutely not going to be a fact. I think that we need to continue to ask board questions from the board. And it doesn't matter if they're new board members or old board members. I think that we as a board are elected to continue to ask questions throughout the process. So although there were a lot of questions, a lot of great questions, and it wasn't because they were new board members. You know, you hear new things all the time, and it's something that you've just kind of like, oh, it's just normal. But it's nice to hear those questions being asked and questioned. So I thank all board members for asking all the different and difficult questions. For me, I kind of agree with the 1% across the board. I really like that in budget cuts. I've advocated for that in the past, and I think I'll continue to advocate for a 1% across the board to be cut. I do think that we do not need any new vehicles. I see our fleets that we have out there, all the different vehicles that we have, either maintenance and also for administration. I think that we don't need to be adding any new vehicles at this time. I also realized that the 12th-month employee that Cascade's asking, I think that would be something that could be cut. The tech ed coaches, I'd like to see those removed. I'd also like to see added all the tutors that we've had, the 70 tutors. I think we probably could fill those positions. We had 60-some. It was a very successful program. I think the staff saw the benefit to that, and I know that our test scores have not been the greatest, and I think starting out with tutors is just a wonderful program. Adding the math program to that would be exceptional. So I'd like to see that our summer school gets funded, maybe even up to $1 million, so that we can get more kids into our schools, our summer schools, because I think over COVID, and I hate using that thing, but we just lost a lot of kids, and we're never going to catch them up. We've got to find ways to do that. A tutoring program, and a summer school, and not just a basic, summer school. I think it really needs to be rehauled, and I think we need to find ways to get these children caught up and provide, as much access as possible for them. So, and I really support that ABLE program. I wish that we would have never got rid of ABLE. I think we should have kept that. I think there's a lot of ways that we can increase that through advertising more. I think there's a need for that. I think sometimes we have to think outside the box where kids don't want to be in school and they would rather learn on, I'm not one of them, and I'm from the old school. I like being in the presence of something, but there's a lot of kids and children that would probably benefit from being at a computer at home and learning, and we got to think that might be an option in the future. So I'd like to see ABLE come back. So these are just some thoughts that I have. And I hate to add this stuff at the end of the year, but at the end of time budget. But seeing that we're not going to get any more funds from the state, I never count on it anyway. But if you did a 1% across the board, that would be $3.6 million, I believe. And I think you could fund some of these and have a little bit left over. So that's where I am as a board member. Thank you.
I really appreciate staff and everything you've done to answer our questions and to add that added level of transparency to our questions for everyone, to explain in such detail what it is we're spending the money on and why it's important is incredible, and I appreciate it. And at this point, I did want to tell you that you kept it to 90 minutes, so
I sure tried.
kudos to you. Dr. Savine?
Yeah, thank you, President Zentmeyer, and certainly superintendent staff appreciates all the comments of board members. That's helpful. I do want to revisit a question that was posed earlier. We have information that was requested information regarding the number of program classrooms that we have K through 12. Currently, we have 71. What is in the budget proposed for next year is 73, and that would include 1 teacher and 4 paras. And we've provided that information. We'll be glad to repurpose that information for the benefit of the board. The other thing that just recognizing that we are now at the phase where this is the board's budget, and to help the superintendent and staff recognizing that in 2 weeks, the board is positioned to make a final decision. I recognize that we've had a number of comments, but I would like to seek consensus of the board. So we have a target amount that the superintendent can work with staff to come back with some recommended cuts to identify some areas that it seems to me, and I'm still seeking President Zentmeyer consensus of the full board. It seems like the reading apprenticeship program, there seems to be a desire to expand that and find at least $660,000. That's, we would have to make a cut somewhere within the existing budget because that is totally grant funded now. There's discussion regarding summer school, perhaps $1 million, and then the addition of ABLE. So that's around $2.6 million. There was comment regarding a 1% cut across the board. So I'm seeking kind of what the desire of the board is in terms of the number of the amount to reduce the budget or the items or just a single amount, whether it's 2.6. I can work with staff to bring it back in terms of our recommended cuts to address, if it is a consensus of the board, to add in reading apprentice tutor program, summer school, and ABLE. We will come back and provide those recommendations unless the board has further recommendations in terms of specific cuts you would like to make.
Can math tutors be in that as well, or was that automatically?
That 70 would include an option to do both reading and math.
Okay, thank you.
And I will say that for me personally, the student intervention specialist in Teen Academy I personally would like to see that back in the budget because I also want to see us, you know, obviously based on need for behaviors, I think we need to make sure that that is fully enrolled as well. So if we are fully utilizing Antietam Academy, then I think we need to have the staff there that would provide that support as well. So I'd like to see that added back into the budget. And I was thinking more along the lines, we probably need, you know, a minimum of probably closer to $4 million so that we could go back and add in some of those things. So for me personally, I think I'd like to keep our school safety assistants staffed the way we began the year, and I'm not interested in maintaining those increases that we did. I think, you know, based on the discussion we had, I don't think, you know, we can really justify adding them if there's no goals or measures of success there. So, you know, so that's kind of where I am with that.
Dr. Savine, can I ask a question? The 5 community schools that we have, do they have money in their budget? Are they allowed to do a summer school program?
The community schools, yes, they have targeted monies which would allow that. Yes.
Okay,
And
For-
those are already planned.
Yeah.
right. And they're
the-
our highest.
Correct. The numbers we gave you represent the schools that are not community schools.
President Zentmeyer and certainly Mr. Evans appreciate that feedback, but still looking to kind of narrow things down. As superintendent, I'm seeking guidance from the board regarding the programs. I'll reference them again: Reading Apprentice Tutors, Summer School, and ABLE. So board in agreement with this amount, which quickly we estimate 2.6 million. There's been comments regarding, hey, maybe we want to target 4 million. I'm seeking direction from the board in terms of what areas there would be a preference for us to cut in order to add these programs in. And I will suggest that, you know, if the board wants to give this some additional thought, we can schedule an additional work session next week. But I am seeking, number one, are these the targeted programs or areas that the board is in agreement that we definitely want to add, make sure are in the budget that are not there right now: Reading Apprentice tutor program, the summer school, and ABLE? And are there any areas that are currently in the budget that the board can agree on that you believe should not be in the budget, needs to be cut? So we can have the superintendent staff at least has guidance in terms of those areas that you'd like to target. We do have a recommendation, or at least it's been suggested, that we just do it across the board 1%. I'm seeking agreement from the board in terms of what is the direction there.
And I asked a question on the, I'm going to harp on this substitute teacher thing. They don't receive an hourly rate, right? They are more like a contracted employee, am I right?
I mean,
They don't receive benefits.
it is not an hourly rate. It's a flat per day or per half-day rate with no
And
benefits.
so if we just did regular substitutes, we are talking about $125,000 just for that group at $5 increase, which would push them over minimum wage, and a $10 for full-time. 140,000, I think, is what I figured up quickly. I'm definitely on board with trying to cut across the board 1%. I think Mike mentioned the vehicles being taken out for this year. There was another 670,000 for hall monitors, or is that, what are they under?
School
School
security
safety.
assistance.
At schools that aren't really having a problem. And all those other, I think you could more than pay for those things that we're asking for with that kind of cut. You know, I asked a question this morning in finance. I said, you know, I asked about surpluses. And we do end up with a little bit of a surplus at the end of each year. And so I think we can take that into account as well. And I know that, you know, I made a statement one time as commissioner that when you see a budget and you see a bunch of zeros after that, that's called fluff. And somebody really gave me a hard time over that statement. But it is a true statement. Nothing comes out to 0, 0, 0 at the end of the year. And so I think it would be, it could be fairly easy to find 1% across the board. So that's where I'm at on it.
I think that I'd like to see our apprentice program, absolutely 35 reading apprentices, maybe 10 math, but keep it conservative until we have money that is not going to be cut from an important place. The 1% across the board sounds great until you figure out what's going. You know, SSAs, no additional school security assistance. Tell me when I've hit something that's wrong. The addition of elementary able, I think that what we need to do is to advertise, to seek those students that have not in the past been contacted by us, and start with Jeremy, Jacoby, and homeschoolers and see who is interested. Mike, what was the last thing you said?
Able, summer school.
Summer school.
Yeah.
Summer school. I guess we believe that summer school is incredibly important so that there's no downtime for kids. I think across the board, just say yes or no if I'm wrong. It's one of the most important things that we do for kids is that continuous learning through the summer. So there you go. What else can we answer?
Okay. So our agreement is, or the desire of the board is 35 reading apprenticeship tutors, which is right around $330,000. A full,
35 or 45, 35 reading and 10 math, so 45.
Just to keep the 70 students, because it's $600,000.
Yeah.
And I would like to stick it, because we already had people up to 60-some students apply for that. So, I mean, and I'm good on the 1%.
Now, were they qualified? That's my question. Were they qualified or were they not?
So we're going off of last year, and I think while I appreciate the additional positions, I would probably recommend that we slowly ramp up if that's the desire of the board, rather than doubling in potentially 1 year. I do think, again, there's value to the program. I think it's worth, but I think if you go too quickly, too fast, you risk the training and everything that goes with it. We can get there if that's the desire, but perhaps just adding a few more, adding in the math and moving in that direction with a long-term goal of getting there might be the best first step.
But with all due respect, that's not what was reported to us at that curriculum instruction meeting when we sat around there, because they said we had 70 qualified people, but we could not take them because we didn't have the funds.
You are 100% accurate on that statement. We did have.
So they were
we
ready
did
to
have-
take them on if they had them. And
We were.
so, I mean, I think that
You
there's
are-
some valid.
Yeah, let me
to
be
that
clear.
whole
Let me be
statement.
clear. You are 100% accurate. Being ready to do it, putting them in schools, supervising, we were thrilled that we had that many. You are spot on. And there probably truly is a need when we go into every school and then some. It is an excellent program. I'm not in any way dismissing it. I'm just simply saying that there is value. When you go too fast, sometimes you make mistakes. And so, again, I'm not against going there long term. Whether it's a year, whether it's 2 years, I'll defer to you. You are the elected board. We did have that many applicants, so you're spot on. I want to be clear.
And they were accepted, but we just didn't have the the money to fulfill that, so they had to
We
back it
only
down to.
chose 35 based on the
Right,
funding.
because the funding.
So can we then just say, well, we'll budget for 70, and obviously if you don't hire the 70, then we take whatever it is we can efficiently accept and then move those funds somewhere else? Does that make sense? And then at that point we can, because I personally want to see us, I think what I would like to see most is more, not necessarily an increase, add anything to the budget, but just shift where we're spending the money. And I think that's something we can do on that, no?
So Mr. Evans, to your point, if the desire of the board is to go with the 70 number, that would be right around $660,000, understanding that we don't know what the interest is right now. Maybe we're close to that, but we would have 660 budgeted. Still, it seems as though there's agreement regarding summer school, another 1 million. Still seeking clarity regarding ABLE. I know there's discussion, seems to be interest in terms of adding that back. Also, there's comments by, or the president referenced, maybe we need to advertise that. So that's around 600,000. So if we go with that, that's 2.6 million. I guess what I'm seeking as a superintendent as I work with staff and the board, there's been discussion regarding 1% cut across the board and then some debate there. Is there any further clarity in terms of what you would like to see cut from the existing budget? I heard that our safety and security employees, we want to keep the existing number and not the expansion. So we have some savings captured there.
That was 640, right? 639,000?
That sounds accurate. I'll let Mr. Prue pull those exact figures, but I'm seeking agreement, President Zentmeyer, regarding what the board's preference would be regarding the cuts. Is it 1% across the board, or would the board desire to maybe target some areas, and then superintendent can work with the staff? I would suggest for your consideration, we consider another work session where we can come back based on feedback of the board next week, go through what we've heard, share with you, so that way at your business meeting later in 2 weeks, you have clear agreement and you're in a better position to approve your final budget.
In order for us to indeed make a qualified decision, we need another work session with you presenting to us what those possible cuts might be. For us to sit here right now and say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, and we're going to cut this, this, and this, without reflection does not sound like a good idea. Can I see a show of hands that you'll be okay with another work session?
Yeah.
Okay, we're in agreement then. Any other comments? This meeting is adjourned.